They didn't just create humanity once. Ancient texts hint at a failed experiment, beings erased, replaced, and buried from history. Missing humans, forbidden knowledge, genetic manipulation by gods from the sky. If we're the second version, what happened to the first, and why was it erased? What the earliest tablets actually record. Clay tablets from southern Mesopotamia provide the earliest written references to the group of deities later labelled the Anunnaki. These tablets come from cities such as Nippur, Ur, Eridu, and Sippar, with the oldest copies dating to the late 3rd millennium BCE. The term Anunna or Anunnaki appears as a collective designation rather than a single identity. It refers to a class of gods associated with authority, decision-making, and the ordering of the world. The word itself is tied to An, the sky god, whose name appears in administrative, ritual, and mythological contexts long before later interpretations emerged. The texts do not form a single narrative. They exist as hymns, epics, legal formulas, and ritual instructions written in Sumerian and later in Akkadian. Among these, the most frequently cited accounts related to human origins appear in the Atrahasis epic, preserved on Old Babylonian tablets dated to around 1800 BCE, and in the Enuma Elish, compiled in a standardized form during the Kassite period, around the 13th century BCE. These texts were copied repeatedly over centuries, sometimes with changes in phrasing, emphasis, and structure. In the Atrahasis epic, the setting is administrative rather than cosmic. The gods are divided into laboring classes. Lower-ranking gods, referred to as the Igigi, are assigned physical work, including the digging of canals and the maintenance of agricultural infrastructure. After a prolonged period, the Igigi revolt. The response described in the text is procedural. A solution is developed to reduce the workload of the gods by creating humans. The creation process is described in practical terms, involving clay mixed with the blood of a slain deity named Wi-Ila, also rendered as Ilawela in some versions. The result is a new being designed to assume labor obligations. The passage does not describe an earlier failed human type. It presents a single act of creation within the context of labor management. The language is direct and administrative. Humans are assigned tasks. Limits are placed on population through later events, including famine, disease, and flood, each introduced as a regulatory measure rather than a moral judgment. The tablets are damaged in places, but the structure of the account is consistent across surviving copies. The Enuma Elish offers a different framing while overlapping in specific details. Composed as a ritual recitation for the Babylonian New Year festival, the text centers on the rise of Marduk to supreme authority. In Tablet VI, after the defeat of Tiamat, Marduk announces the creation of humans. The material used is the blood of Kingu, a defeated god associated with rebellion. The stated purpose again involves service. Humans are created to relieve the gods of labor so the divine assembly may rest. This second account does not present itself as a revision of the first. It functions within a different theological hierarchy. Names change, authority shifts. The process of creation remains singular within the narrative. Scholars have long noted that Mesopotamian myths often coexist without reconciliation. Multiple versions of events are preserved without concern for contradiction, as each text serves a local or ritual function. Claims of humans being created more than once do not appear explicitly in these primary sources. What does appear are editorial layers. Tablets from Assur, Nineveh, and Babylon show evidence of reworking. Scribal colophons indicate copying and correction. In some fragments, lines are reordered or replaced. These changes reflect shifts in religious emphasis rather than records of historical events. The gods involved vary depending on the city producing the tablet. Enki plays a central role in Sumerian versions, while Ea appears in Akkadian adaptations. The function of humans remains consistent. Archaeological context supports this reading. The tablets were found in temple libraries and palace archives, often alongside legal contracts, inventories, and letters. They were not isolated records. They existed within bureaucratic systems that valued continuity. The absence of any clear reference to an earlier human species in these records is notable given the level of detail preserved in other areas, such as lineage lists, city foundations, and reign durations. Later Mesopotamian king lists add another layer. The Sumerian king list records rulers before and after a flood, with reign lengths that decrease dramatically after the event. Some later interpretations link this division to a change in humanity. The text itself does not. It states that kingship descended from heaven, moved between cities, and continued. The people governed before and after the flood are not distinguished as separate creations. The transition is administrative, not biological. The Anunnaki themselves undergo changes in depiction over time. In early Sumerian texts, they are not creators. They function as judges in the underworld or as members of a divine council. Creation acts are attributed primarily to Enki, Ninhursag, or later Marduk. The Anunnaki appear as witnesses or enforcers rather than engineers. This distinction is often lost in later summaries but remains clear in the source material. During the first millennium BCE, Assyrian and Babylonian scribes compiled and standardized older myths. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, excavated in the 19th century, contained many of the tablets now referenced in modern discussions. These tablets were catalogued, translated, and compared. No version among them introduces a completed human population that is later replaced by another through deliberate redesign. What does appear are repeated attempts to regulate human numbers and behavior. Flood narratives, including the account of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, describe destruction followed by survival, not replacement. The surviving humans continue the same lineage. The gods adjust their methods afterward, introducing measures such as infant mortality and shortened lifespans. These are framed as controls, not as corrections of a failed design. Modern claims of multiple human creations often rely on selective readings or later reinterpretations, particularly those published in the 20th century. These interpretations frequently merge Mesopotamian texts with modern concepts of genetics or extraterrestrial intervention. Such frameworks do not appear in the original language or context of the tablets. The ancient texts remain focused on labor, hierarchy, and order. The earliest records, when read in sequence and within their archaeological setting, show continuity rather than reset. The Anunnaki appear as part of an administrative cosmology. Humans are introduced once as a workforce. Subsequent events modify conditions but not origin. The tablets end without commentary on alternative human types or abandoned creations. They simply continue, copied and recopied, as part of a living textual tradition. Variations across cities and dynasties. The surviving records that mention human creation are not centralized documents. They come from different cities, written at different times, under different political authorities. Each city maintained its own temple economy, scribal school, and theological emphasis. As a result, the same event is often described using different names, sequences, and divine roles. These variations are visible in tablets from Nippur, Eridu, Lagash, Babylon, and Assur, spanning more than 1,000 years of copying and adaptation. In Nippur, a city closely associated with the god Enlil, creation accounts tend to emphasize authority and decree. Tablets recovered from the Ikur temple complex describe divine decisions being made in assembly. Humans appear as the outcome of formal resolution rather than experimentation. The language used in these texts resembles legal instruction. Actions are approved, carried out, and enforced. The emphasis is on order. Creation is not framed as a problem to be solved, but as an administrative necessity. By contrast, texts associated with Eridu place Enki at the center. Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea, is linked to wisdom, fresh water, and technical knowledge. In these versions, creation involves practical steps. Clay is shaped. Instructions are followed. Ninhursag, or Mami, appears as a birth goddess overseeing the process. The tone is procedural. Humans are produced through collaboration, not command. Even here, however, the outcome is singular. There is no record of a discarded or replaced human group. Lagash tablets show another variation. The city's inscriptions emphasize labor, irrigation, and land management. In hymns and foundation texts, humans are described as workers assigned to fields, canals, and temples. Creation references are brief and functional. They serve to justify obligations rather than to describe origins in detail. The gods create, humans serve, and the system continues. No temporal division of humanity is recorded. When political power shifted toward Babylon, theological focus followed. Marduk rose in prominence, and earlier myths were reorganized to reflect this hierarchy. The Enuma Elish represents this process. Older gods are retained but subordinated. Creation is reframed as an act that confirms Babylonian authority. Even so, the text does not replace earlier humans with new ones. It reassigns credit. The function of humans remains unchanged. Assyrian adaptations further illustrate this pattern. Tablets from Assur and Nineveh preserve earlier stories but adjust names and titles. Assur replaces Enlil in some contexts. Marduk's role is modified or reduced. The scribes did not erase previous versions. They copied them alongside revisions. This coexistence of texts suggests that contradiction was acceptable. Consistency was not required. What remains consistent is the absence of multiple creation cycles. The scribal process itself explains much of the variation. Scribes were trained through repetition. They copied older tablets line by line, sometimes inserting clarifications or local references. Colophons often record the name of the scribe, the place of copying, and the source tablet used. Errors were corrected. Damaged lines were reconstructed. These practices produced families of texts rather than fixed originals. Archaeological findings support this. Fragments of the Atrahasis epic found at Sippar differ slightly from those found at Ashur. Some lines are missing, others are expanded. The core sequence remains. Humans are created once to relieve divine labor. Later events regulate population. Flood, famine, and disease recur as mechanisms. None are described as resets of humanity itself. The Sumerian king list provides a useful comparison. It records rulers before and after a flood, with reign lengths that change sharply. The transition is marked, but the population is continuous. Kingship moves. Cities fall and rise. Humanity persists. It documents administrative continuity through disruption. Temple hymns reinforce this view. Hymns to Enlil, Enki, and Inanna frequently reference humans as long-established participants in ritual life. Offerings are made, labor is performed, cities are maintained. These texts assume human presence without qualification. They do not distinguish between types or generations beyond genealogy. During the Old Babylonian period, around 1900 to 1600 BCE, legal texts and contracts appear alongside mythological tablets. These documents refer to humans as established social actors. Slaves, farmers, craftsmen, and officials are recorded by name. There is no indication of a recent creation or replacement event in the cultural memory preserved by these records. Later, during the Neo-Assyrian period, scholars compiled encyclopedic collections of omens, rituals, and myths. The goal was preservation. Tablets were stored, catalogued, and indexed. The library of Ashurbanipal reflects this effort. Multiple versions of creation myths were kept together. None describe an earlier human group being eliminated due to failure. Differences between texts often result from theological politics rather than historical claims. Cities elevated their patron gods. Myths were adjusted accordingly. Creation narratives were tools of legitimacy. They explained why humans served temples and kings. They did not function as scientific or historical explanations in the modern sense. The Anunnaki, across these variations, remain a collective presence. In some cities they act as judges. In others they attend assemblies. Their role shifts, but their function as administrators of order remains stable. They do not appear as engineers conducting repeated trials. They appear as officials within a system. Translation history has also shaped modern perception. Early translators in the 19th and early 20th centuries worked with incomplete fragments. Gaps were filled cautiously, sometimes with brackets. Later readers interpreted these gaps creatively. Subsequent translations refined the language, often removing ambiguity. The original tablets, however, remain unchanged. Across regions and dynasties, the pattern holds. One creation event is described in multiple ways. Authority shifts, names change, functions remain. Humans are introduced once and managed afterward. The record does not preserve a narrative of replacement. It preserves a record of adaptation within a stable framework. Flood accounts as administrative response. Flood narratives appear across Mesopotamian literature as formal records of disruption rather than stories of renewal. The earliest known version is preserved on fragmented Sumerian tablets dated to approximately 21st century BCE, often referred to as the Eridu Genesis. Later versions appear in the Atrahasis epic and in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Each version was copied and edited over long periods, but their structural purpose remains consistent. They describe an interruption in human activity followed by continuation, not replacement. In the Eridu Genesis, the text opens with the creation of cities and the assignment of kingship. Humanity is already present. The flood is introduced after noise and population growth are mentioned as problems for the gods. The language used does not indicate moral failure. It describes disturbance. The response is a decision to send a flood. The god Enki warns a single individual, Ziusudra, through indirect speech. After the flood subsides, Ziusudra offers sacrifices, and life resumes. The text ends without reference to a new human type or a revised creation process. The Atrahasis epic provides the most detailed administrative framing. The flood is not the first measure taken. Earlier tablets describe famine and disease introduced to reduce human numbers. These measures fail to achieve lasting results. Humans adapt, population increases again. The flood is presented as a final regulatory action. The decision is debated among the gods. Enlil advocates destruction. Enki circumvents the order by warning Atrahasis. The outcome is survival of a portion of humanity, not total elimination. Following the flood, the text records policy changes. New controls are introduced. Infant mortality is established. Certain women are assigned roles that prevent childbirth. Human lifespan is reduced. These measures are explicit. They are described as lasting regulations intended to stabilize the system. The existence of such controls implies continuity of the same human population. There is no indication of redesign or recreation. Tablet XI of the Epic of Gilgamesh presents the flood as a recounting rather than a direct narrative. Utnapishtim speaks in the first person, describing events long past. His account closely parallels Atrahasis, but omits many administrative details. The focus is on memory and survival. Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality. Humanity outside the boat continues. The text does not suggest that those who survive are different in kind from those who perished. Across all versions, the flood is framed as excessive. In later lines of Atrahasis, Enlil expresses regret at the scale of destruction. This regret is practical, rather than emotional. The loss of offerings and labor is noted. The gods require human activity to maintain temples and rituals. This dependency reinforces the idea that humans are not disposable prototypes. They are necessary components of the system. Archaeological data provides additional context. Flood layers have been identified at sites such as Shurapak, Kish, and Ur, dated to around 2900 BCE. These layers indicate localized flooding rather than a single global event. The textual flood narratives likely reflect cultural memory of repeated regional disasters. The myths compress these events into a single account for ritual and instructional use. The presence of flood narratives does not imply a break in human continuity. Settlement layers above flood deposits show rebuilding. Material culture remains consistent. Pottery styles, tool types, and burial practices continue with gradual change rather than abrupt replacement. This archaeological continuity aligns with the textual presentation of survival and regulation rather than restart. Later, Mesopotamian texts refer back to the flood as a known event. Kings boast of restoring temples destroyed by water. Ritual texts include offerings meant to prevent future floods. These references treat the flood as historical precedent, not as a reset of humanity. The people performing these rituals see themselves as descendants of survivors, not as a new creation. The Anunnaki appear in these accounts as participants in decision-making. They attend assemblies, they witness oaths, they enforce outcomes, they do not conduct experiments. Their role is bureaucratic. Even when disagreement occurs, it is resolved through negotiation rather than revision of design. The system adapts. Comparisons with other ancient cultures reinforce this pattern. Flood narratives in Akkadian, Sumerian, and later Hebrew traditions all preserve survival through a single lineage. While theological interpretations differ, the structural element of continuity remains. Destruction is partial. Memory persists. Translation history has occasionally obscured this point. Early translators emphasized dramatic elements. Later popular works interpreted the flood as evidence of failure. The original language does not support this reading. Terms used for destruction are paired with terms for restraint and preservation. The balance is deliberate. In administrative texts from the Old Babylonian period, humans are described as existing long after the flood. Genealogies extend backward without interruption. Temple records list offerings since the days before the flood, implying continuity of institutions. These references treat the flood as a temporal marker, not a boundary between different kinds of humans. Flood accounts also appear in omen literature. Certain signs are interpreted as reminders of the flood. These omens are warnings, not prophecies of replacement. They assume that the same human population remains subject to regulation. The persistence of flood narratives across centuries suggests their importance as cautionary records. They demonstrate limits. They justify controls. They reinforce hierarchy. They do not describe experimentation or abandonment. The gods adjust methods rather than products. Within the broader corpus of Mesopotamian texts, floods function as administrative corrections. Human creation precedes them. Human management follows. The sequence does not reset. It continues under modified conditions, lifespan reduction and institutional limits. Texts produced in Mesopotamia after the composition of flood narratives introduce a set of measures intended to regulate human presence over time. These measures are described with clarity and specificity. They do not appear as symbolic gestures. They are recorded as lasting conditions. Among these, the reduction of human lifespan occupies a central place. References to this change appear most clearly in the Atrahasis epic, preserved in Old Babylonian copies dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE, with parallel ideas appearing in later Akkadian and Assyrian materials. In the Atrahasis epic, the reduction of lifespan is presented as a response to imbalance. After the flood, the gods convene. The problem identified is not moral failure. It is numerical pressure. Human noise, growth, and persistence are described as disruptive to divine rest. The solution is not elimination. It is limitation. The text lists specific measures that will prevent population from reaching earlier levels. These measures include shortened lifespans, the introduction of infant mortality, and the establishment of priestly roles that remove certain women from reproduction. The language used in these passages is procedural. Each measure is described as an assignment. The goddess Nintu, also known as Mami or Ninhursag depending on the version, is instructed to establish new conditions for birth and death. Lines refer to women who will not bear children and to infants who will not survive. These statements are not framed as punishments. They are framed as controls. The goal stated in the text is stability. Earlier Sumerian king lists provide an important comparison. The Sumerian king list records reigns of antediluvian kings lasting tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar follows with 36,000 years. After the flood, reign lengths drop sharply. Kings rule for hundreds of years, then tens, then standard human spans. The text presents this shift without explanation. It is recorded as a fact. The king list itself exists in multiple versions, dated from the early 2nd millennium BCE through the 1st millennium BCE. Despite variations in names and order, the pattern remains consistent. Extreme longevity belongs to the period before the flood. Normalized lifespans follow. The list does not suggest that the post-flood kings are a different species. It presents continuity of kingship with altered conditions. Administrative and legal documents from the same periods reinforce this interpretation. Contracts, land grants, and court records assume human lifespans consistent with the post-flood pattern. Individuals appear, age, and disappear from the record. Inheritance documents reference fathers and sons within expected generational intervals. No legal text remarks on a recent change in human biology. The reduction of lifespan appears as an accepted condition, not a recent shock. Medical texts from Mesopotamia also reflect this stability. Diagnostic tablets from the Old Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian periods describe diseases associated with aging. They refer to weakness of limbs, loss of sight, and decline of strength. These texts assume a human life course with predictable stages. There is no indication that scribes viewed aging as a new phenomenon. It is treated as established reality. The role of the Anunnaki in these changes is indirect. In Atrahasis, they are present at the assembly where decisions are made. They witness the agreement. Enforcement is assigned to specific deities. The Anunnaki do not perform the modifications themselves. They function as part of the governing body that authorizes them. Their presence reinforces the administrative nature of the process. Later mythological texts echo these ideas without repeating the details. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero's search for immortality ends in failure. Utnapishtim explains that eternal life was granted once and will not be granted again. The explanation is brief. It does not reference creation. It references limitation. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and resumes mortal life. The city walls endure. The people remain finite. Temple hymns from the Ur-3 period, around 21st century BCE, praise kings for restoring order and maintaining boundaries. They refer to humans as fragile and time-bound. These descriptions are not presented as losses. They are presented as conditions that define proper function. The tone is acceptance. Mortality is embedded in ritual language. In omen literature, lifespan appears as a variable within limits. Certain omens predict long life, others short. None predict a return to antediluvian spans. The frame of reference is already constrained. The gods may extend or shorten an individual life, but within an established range. This suggests that lifespan reduction was fully integrated into Mesopotamian thought by the time these texts were compiled. Burial practices also provide context. Early dynastic graves show continuity in treatment of the dead before and after flood layers. There is no sudden change in funerary customs that would indicate a new type of human body or social role. Grave goods evolve gradually. The dead are honored in similar ways across periods. Ancestor cults persist. The introduction of institutional roles that limit reproduction appears in both mythological and historical contexts. Priestesses dedicated to specific deities were often prohibited from bearing children. Administrative texts list such individuals and their rations. These roles existed within the human community. They did not signal removal from humanity. They were functional positions that supported temple economy and ritual continuity. Infant mortality, referenced in Atrahasis, is reflected in archaeological data. High rates of infant burial are documented across Mesopotamian sites. Small graves, often beneath house floors, indicate acceptance of early death as part of life. They codify it. They provide an explanation that aligns with lived experience. Lifespan reduction is also implied in later genealogical records. Assyrian royal inscriptions list ancestors over many generations with plausible ages. These inscriptions aim to establish legitimacy through continuity. They do not claim descent from an earlier, longer-lived human type. The past is human, but constrained. Comparative material from neighboring cultures supports the same pattern. Egyptian king lists, while using different frameworks, also show divine or semi-divine longevity in distant pasts and normalized lifespans in historical periods. This structural pattern appears across ancient Near Eastern cultures. It reflects mythological distance rather than biological replacement. Modern interpretations that frame lifespan reduction as evidence of genetic modification rely on external concepts not present in the texts. They record decisions, not mechanisms. The reduction is a rule, not a redesign. The texts do not describe physical alteration of the human body. They describe the establishment of limits. Translation choices have sometimes blurred this distinction. Words rendered as curse or punishment in early translations have been reassessed. In many cases, the original terms imply assignment or decree. The shift in translation emphasizes governance rather than judgment. This aligns with the administrative tone of the texts. The consistency of lifespan limitation across centuries suggests that it was not remembered as a recent change. It functioned as a background condition. Scribes did not debate it. They did not explain it repeatedly. It was assumed. Only in mythological retrospection does the contrast with antediluvian times appear, serving to mark distance rather than loss. The Anunnaki remain present as overseers of order throughout this process. Their role does not expand. They do not become creators or destroyers of types. They witness and enforce established limits. Their function remains stable across texts. Taken together, Mesopotamian records present lifespan reduction as part of a broader system of regulation introduced after disruption. Humans remain the same category of being. Their conditions change. The system adapts. The texts preserve this adaptation without framing it as failure or replacement. Labor as a standing arrangement. Mesopotamian texts describe human labor not as a temporary solution but as a permanent condition embedded in social order. From the earliest administrative tablets of the late 4th millennium BCE through the Neo-Assyrian period, humans appear in records primarily as workers. This role is not framed as imposed after failure. It is treated as foundational. Labor defines the relationship between humans, temples, and governing authorities. The earliest economic tablets from Uruk, dated to around 3200 BCE, record rations of grain and beer distributed to workers. These tablets are not mythological. They are accounting documents. Names are listed. Tasks are assigned. Outputs are measured. The presence of such records indicates that by the time writing developed, human labor was already structured and expected. No text from this period suggests a recent transition into this role. Mythological accounts align with this administrative reality. In the Atrahasis epic, the creation of humans is explicitly linked to labor. The gods seek relief from work related to canal digging, field maintenance, and construction. Humans are created to assume these responsibilities. After the flood and the introduction of regulatory measures, this arrangement does not change. The same labor expectations continue under new constraints. Temple archives from cities such as Lagash and Umma provide detailed insight into how labor functioned. These records span generations. Laborers are born, assigned rations, promoted, and replaced. The continuity of these records suggests stability rather than adjustment following a failed experiment. The language used in these documents is consistent. Humans are described as dependents of institutions. Temples and palaces provide food, clothing, and shelter in exchange for work. This system is recorded without justification. It is presented as standard practice. There is no indication that scribes viewed labor as a corrective measure introduced after some earlier state. Royal inscriptions reinforce this view. Kings describe themselves as builders, restorers, and organizers of labor. Gudea of Lagash, ruling around 2200 BCE, records the construction of temples using human labor directed under divine instruction. His inscriptions list materials, routes, and workforce organization. Humans appear as agents carrying out tasks, not as newly designed beings adapting to a changed role. The Anunnaki appear in these contexts as guarantors of order. In hymns and prayers, they are invoked to ensure that labor proceeds smoothly. They are associated with judgment and allocation. They do not appear as supervisors conducting trials or evaluations of human performance. Their presence legitimizes the system rather than modifying it. Legal texts further demonstrate the permanence of labor obligations. The Code of Ur-Nama, dated to around 2100 BCE, and later the Code of Hammurabi, dated to around 1750 BCE, include laws regulating labor. Wages, penalties, and responsibilities are specified. These laws assume that labor relationships are long established. They regulate conduct within a system, not the system itself. Debt, labor, and slavery are also documented. Individuals may enter service due to debt or be born into servitude. These conditions are recorded matter-of-factly. The texts do not frame them as deviations from an original human purpose. They are variations within a known structure. Human value is tied to productivity. Ritual texts support this framework. Offerings are required to maintain favor with the gods. Humans prepare and present these offerings. The gods are described as consuming offerings symbolically. The continuity of ritual depends on human participation. Without labor, the system fails. This dependency is acknowledged in mythological passages where gods regret excessive destruction due to loss of offerings. Agricultural calendars also reflect institutional labor. Tablets record planting and harvest times, irrigation schedules, and workforce rotations. These documents rely on predictable human activity. They do not account for a changing human role or capacity. Labor is stable enough to support long-term planning. Even in literary texts, labor remains central. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the city of Uruk is defined by its walls, built through organized human effort. Gilgamesh's authority is exercised through command over people. His failure and return do not alter this structure. The city endures. Work continues. The reduction of lifespan described in earlier texts does not reduce labor expectations. Instead, it intensifies the need for continuity. Shorter lives require consistent replacement of workers. Administrative texts reflect this through constant tracking of personnel. New names appear as old ones disappear. The system absorbs loss without structural change. There is no evidence in Mesopotamian records of a time when humans were not expected to work. There is also no indication of an earlier human group with a different function. The myths describe creation in terms of assignment, not experimentation. Humans are introduced with a role already defined. Later commentaries and lexical lists compiled in the first millennium BCE include definitions of words related to labor. These lists preserve meanings that had been stable for centuries. The consistency of terminology suggests that the concept of human labor was not evolving rapidly. It was foundational. Modern interpretations that suggest an earlier, non-laboring humanity rely on extrapolation rather than textual evidence. The Mesopotamian record does not preserve such a distinction. Where differences appear, they are temporal markers used to structure myth, not descriptions of alternate human conditions. Across mythological, administrative, legal, and ritual texts, labor appears as the primary human function. It is regulated, measured, and expected. The Anunnaki authorize and oversee order but do not redefine it. Humans remain within the same framework before and after disruption events. The record shows adaptation within continuity. Floods, lifespan reduction, and population controls adjust conditions. Labor persists. The system remains intact. The Anunnaki within the system of authority. The Anunnaki are described less as active agents of creation and more as participants in a governing structure. Their presence is consistent, but their actions are limited. They appear in assemblies, judgments, and confirmations. This pattern is visible from early Sumerian hymns through later Akkadian and Assyrian compilations, spanning more than a millennium of textual transmission. The earliest references to the Anunnaki occur in Sumerian compositions dated to the late 3rd millennium BCE. In these texts, the term refers to a collective body rather than to named individuals. The Anunnaki are associated with An, the sky god, and are often described as his offspring or as members of his court. Their function is not explained in detail. They are present when decisions are made. Their role is assumed rather than defined. In hymns from Nippur, the Anunnaki are listed among the gods who fix the destinies. This phrase appears repeatedly in ritual language. Fixing destinies does not involve construction or experimentation. It refers to assigning outcomes within an existing order. The language mirrors administrative practice. Decisions are recorded. Authority is distributed. Enforcement follows. Underworld texts provide further clarity. In compositions such as Inanna's Descent, the Anunnaki appear as judges seated in the underworld. They pronounce outcomes. They do not debate origins or redesign beings. Their authority is judicial. Once a decision is made, it is final. This reinforces their role as stabilizers rather than innovators. Creation narratives place the Anunnaki at a distance from the act itself. In the Atrahasis epic, the assembly that approves human creation includes the Anunnaki, but the technical work is assigned elsewhere. Enki provides instruction. Nintu carries out the formation. The Anunnaki witness and authorize. Their involvement is procedural. In the Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki appear again as an assembled group. After Marduk's victory, they build him a shrine and confirm his authority. When humans are created, the Anunnaki acknowledge the act. They do not participate in the process. The text emphasizes their approval, not their contribution. This distinction is consistent across tablets, Lexical lists compiled by scribes during the Old Babylonian and later periods classify gods by function. The Anunnaki are grouped with terms related to judgment and assembly. They are not grouped with craftsmen, gods, or birth deities. This classification reflects how scribes understood divine roles. The Anunnaki belong to governance. Administrative metaphors reinforce this interpretation. Gods are described as holding offices, issuing decrees, and receiving reports. The Anunnaki appear within this framework as council members. Their authority derives from position, not from technical skill. They do not modify systems, they maintain them. This role becomes more pronounced in later Assyrian texts. In royal inscriptions, kings claim that the Anunnaki support their rule. They are invoked as guarantors of law and stability. The inscriptions do not credit them with creation or alteration of humanity. They are associated with legitimacy. Ritual texts offer additional evidence. When oaths are sworn, the Anunnaki are listed among the divine witnesses. Their function is to observe and enforce. Witnessing does not involve intervention. It involves record and consequence. The same language appears in legal contexts involving human courts, suggesting deliberate parallelism. The Anunnaki also appear in curse formulas. Violations of agreements are said to bring the judgment of the Anunnaki. These passages emphasize punishment for disorder. They do not describe corrective redesign. The response to violation is enforcement, not revision. In myths addressing crisis, such as flood narratives, the Anunnaki remain present but restrained. They attend assemblies. They react to outcomes. In some versions of Atrahasis, they weep after the flood due to loss of offerings. This response highlights dependency on human activity rather than control over human form. The gods require continuity. The limited agency of the Anunnaki contrasts with modern portrayals that depict them as engineers or planners. The original texts do not support such roles. They do not describe tools, methods, or trials conducted by the Anunnaki. They describe meetings, decrees, and judgments. The consistency of this depiction across time suggests intentional preservation. Scribal traditions valued accuracy in divine roles. While myths were adapted to local theology, core functions remained intact. The Anunnaki's role as overseers persisted even as other gods rose or fell in prominence. Differences between cities do not alter this pattern. Whether in Sumerian, Akkadian, or Assyrian contexts, the Anunnaki occupy positions of authority without technical involvement. Their titles change slightly. Their function does not. This distinction matters when evaluating claims of repeated human creation. A group responsible for experimentation or redesign would require agency and description. The texts do not assign such agency to the Anunnaki. Creation acts are delegated. Oversight remains collective. Even in late scholarly texts, where gods are catalogued and explained, the Anunnaki are not credited with innovation. Commentaries focus on their jurisdiction. They preside over fate, law, and boundary. These domains require stability. The absence of narrative attention to the Anunnaki during moments of change is notable. When creation occurs, other gods act. When regulation is introduced, specific deities are named. The Anunnaki observe. Their presence signals legitimacy rather than causation. This pattern aligns with the broader Mesopotamian worldview. Order is maintained through hierarchy. Change is managed through decree. Authority is distributed. The Anunnaki embody the institutional layer of this system. Across the corpus, they function as overseers. They do not appear as designers. They do not conduct revisions. Their role is to ensure that what has been established remains enforced. The texts reflect this role consistently and without emphasis. Where modern readings begin to shift. The texts that describe the Anunnaki, human creation, and post-flood regulation entered modern study through a process shaped by excavation, preservation, and translation. This process unfolded unevenly over more than a century. Early discoveries were fragmentary. Tablets were broken, weathered, and incomplete. Lines were missing. Context was uncertain. What followed was not a single interpretation but a sequence of revisions, each influenced by the tools, assumptions, and academic climate of its time. The first large-scale recovery of Mesopotamian tablets occurred in the mid-19th century. Excavations at sites such as Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad, carried out by Austin Henry Layard and others, uncovered thousands of clay tablets. Many were transported to museums in London, Paris, and Berlin. At the time of discovery, the scripts were undeciphered. The tablets were catalogued by shape and appearance, rather than by content. Decipherment progressed gradually. By the 1850s, scholars such as Henry Rawlinson and Edward Hincks had begun to read Akkadian cuneiform. Sumerian followed later. Early translations focused on royal inscriptions and recognizable names. Mythological texts received attention once basic grammar was established. The Epic of Gilgamesh was among the first major literary works to be reconstructed, largely from tablets found in the library of Ashurbanipal. These early translations were cautious but incomplete. Missing lines were indicated with brackets. In some cases, restorations were proposed based on parallels from other texts. This practice was standard. It allowed narratives to be read as continuous works. It also introduced interpretive risk. Restored lines reflected scholarly judgment rather than physical evidence. Later translators revised many of these restorations as new fragments were found. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Assyriology developed as a formal academic discipline. Universities established chairs, journals were founded, translation conventions became standardized. Scholars such as Friedrich Delitzsch, Samuel Noah Kramer, and Leonard Woolley contributed to the growing corpus. Their work emphasized philology, context, and comparison across texts. At the same time, popular interest in ancient civilizations increased. Public lectures, museum exhibits, and general audience books presented Mesopotamian myths alongside those of Egypt and Greece. In this environment, creation stories attracted attention. Parallels with biblical narratives were noted. Flood accounts were compared. Human origins became a focal point for discussion. Interpretive divergence began to appear at this stage. Academic publications maintained caution. Popular treatments sometimes simplified. Complex administrative language was rendered into narrative form. Terms associated with decree or assignment were translated with words that implied intention or experimentation. These choices were not always incorrect, but they carried connotations not present in the original language. The term Anunnaki itself illustrates this shift. In the original texts, it functions as a collective noun. It rarely appears with descriptive modifiers. In modern usage, it became a proper name associated with specific actions. This transformation occurred gradually, through repetition in secondary literature rather than through primary evidence. Fragmentation played a role. Many tablets preserve only portions of myths. Where one tablet ends, another begins with variation. Modern editors arranged these fragments into linear narratives. This was necessary for readability. It also created the impression of coherence, where the ancient record preserves multiplicity. Variations that once coexisted became alternatives from which readers selected. By the mid-20th century, a significant body of translated material was available. Scholarly consensus held that Mesopotamian myths were symbolic, administrative, and theological texts. They were not treated as historical records. Creation accounts were understood as explanations of social order. The Anunnaki were described as a council of gods, not as technicians. A shift occurred outside academic circles in the later 20th century. New interpretive frameworks emerged that emphasized literal readings. These frameworks often drew on modern scientific language, particularly concepts related to genetics, engineering, and extraterrestrial life. Mesopotamian terms were reinterpreted through these lenses. This shift did not arise from new tablet discoveries. It arose from reinterpretation of existing translations. Passages describing the mixing of clay and divine blood were recast as descriptions of genetic manipulation. Terms referring to labor and service were reframed as evidence of design purpose. The absence of technical detail was treated as omission rather than as indication of symbolic language. Translation choices were sometimes revisited selectively. Words with multiple meanings were narrowed to fit new frameworks. For example, Akkadian terms related to forming or shaping were treated as technical processes rather than as conventional metaphors used across many contexts, including pottery and ritual preparation. Chronology also played a role. Mesopotamian king lists, with their long reigns before the flood, were read as records of non-human rulers. The reduction in reign lengths after the flood was interpreted as a change in biological capacity. The text itself does not state this. It records reigns without explanation. The interpretive leap occurred later. Another factor was the merging of sources from different cultures. Mesopotamian myths were combined with later traditions, including Hellenistic interpretations and modern speculative works. Distinctions between Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian contexts were blurred. Differences that once indicated local theology were treated as chronological stages of a single experiment. Academic responses to these interpretations were restrained. Scholars continued to publish critical editions and translations. They emphasized context. They noted where popular claims exceeded evidence. These discussions largely remained within academic journals. Public-facing rebuttals were limited. The rise of digital media amplified alternative readings. Extracted quotations circulated without context. Fragmentary lines were presented as complete statements. The cumulative effect was a narrative of repeated creation and abandonment that does not appear in the tablets themselves, but feels cohesive when assembled from isolated phrases. It is important to note that modern reinterpretations often rely on earlier translations rather than on updated editions. Many translations from the early 20th century have since been revised. New fragments have clarified ambiguous passages. Some restorations have been removed. Where earlier editions suggested uncertainty, later ones provide clearer readings that reduce speculative space. The physical tablets remain unchanged. They do not record a first human species eliminated due to failure. They do not describe a second creation correcting errors. They record a single introduction of humans followed by regulation. Modern divergence arises not from the tablets, but from the frameworks applied to them. Museum practices have also influenced perception. Display labels often simplify. Creation myths are summarized in a few sentences. Nuance is lost. Visitors encounter condensed narratives that emphasize drama. These summaries are not incorrect, but they are incomplete. They omit administrative context. Educational materials further compress. Textbooks present Mesopotamian myths as stories rather than as records embedded in economic and ritual systems. This presentation encourages narrative interpretation. Readers expect arcs, failures, and revisions. Language evolution adds another layer. Terms translated into English carry connotations shaped by modern usage. Words like create, design, and experiment imply intention and testing. The original languages used terms related to making, assigning, and ordering. The role of silence in the record is often misunderstood. Absence of explanation is not evidence of hidden process. Mesopotamian texts frequently state outcomes without detailing mechanisms. This applies to creation, disease, and natural events. The texts assume shared cultural understanding. Modern readers lack this background and may fill gaps with speculation. Comparative studies reinforce caution. When Mesopotamian myths are compared with administrative texts, consistency emerges. Humans are laborers. Gods govern. Regulation follows disruption. The system adapts. There is no phase of abandonment. There is no record of redesign. The Anunnaki, within this framework, remain administrative figures. Their modern portrayal as engineers arises from reinterpretation rather than from textual description. The shift occurs when modern categories are imposed on ancient roles. Scholarly editions published in the late 20th and early 21st centuries reflect this understanding. Critical apparatuses list variant readings. Commentary addresses ambiguity. Conclusions are restrained. These works emphasize that the texts preserve worldview, not experiment logs. The divergence between academic consensus and popular interpretation continues. It is sustained by selective citation and by the appeal of alternative narratives. The ancient record itself remains stable. It does not expand to accommodate these readings. Understanding where modern readings begin to shift requires attention to process rather than to content. Excavation, translation, restoration, and presentation each introduce interpretive layers. Over time, these layers accumulate. Some harden into narratives that feel ancient but are modern in structure. The tablets, when read as they are, do not change. They describe governance, labor, and limitation. They do not describe iteration. The divergence arises when readers seek answers to questions the texts were not written to address: fragmentary evidence and the limits of the record. The surviving Mesopotamian corpus is incomplete by design and by circumstance. Clay tablets endure, but they break. Fire preserves them unevenly. Water erodes surfaces. Excavation recovers fragments without sequence. What remains is a record defined as much by absence as by presence. Understanding this limitation is essential when assessing claims that extend beyond what the texts explicitly state. Most mythological tablets survive in fragments. A single composition may be reconstructed from dozens of pieces found across different sites and centuries. The Atrahasis epic, for example, exists in Old Babylonian, Middle Babylonian, and Neo-Assyrian fragments. Editors assemble a composite text by aligning overlapping lines and parallel passages. Where gaps occur, they are marked. The physical record does not preserve continuity. These gaps are not neutral. Missing sections invite inference. In academic editions, uncertainty is maintained through brackets, ellipses, and commentary. In secondary retellings, these markers often disappear. A reconstructed narrative can appear seamless even when large portions are inferred. This shift alters how readers perceive certainty. Tablet damage follows patterns. Edges break first. Beginnings and endings are frequently lost. As a result, introductions and conclusions are underrepresented. What survives are often central sections. This skews interpretation. Administrative decisions are preserved without framing context. Outcomes appear without recorded deliberation. Modern readers may supply motives or stages not present in the surviving text. The physical layout of tablets also matters. Many were written on multiple columns. Breaks can remove entire columns, leaving isolated lines. A passage describing regulation may survive without the preceding rationale. Outside academic contexts, these connections may be treated as definitive. Colophons occasionally note missing material. Some tablets explicitly state that lines are broken or unreadable. Scribes sometimes copied damaged originals and noted uncertainty. This indicates that even in antiquity, records were incomplete. The tradition accepted fragmentation as part of preservation. Archaeological context reinforces this. Tablets were stored in archives that suffered destruction. The library of Ashurbanipal survived due to fire that baked the clay. Other archives dissolved in floods or were reused as building material. What survives is accidental. It does not represent a curated account of origins. This accidental survival affects distribution. Certain genres are overrepresented. Administrative texts survive in large numbers because they were produced constantly. Mythological texts are rarer. Creation accounts exist in far fewer copies than ration lists or legal contracts. This imbalance limits how much detail is available for interpretation. The absence of explicit statements about multiple human creations must be weighed against this context. Silence alone does not prove non-existence. At the same time, the surviving record preserves extensive detail on other matters. When a concept is important, it tends to appear repeatedly. Human labor obligations, lifespan limits, and flood regulation recur across genres. Multiple creation cycles do not. Fragmentary evidence also complicates chronology. A broken line may be dated based on paleography or archaeological layer, but exact year is often uncertain. This uncertainty allows later readers to reorder events conceptually. Separate texts from different centuries may be read as sequential stages rather than as parallel traditions. Lexical lists highlight another limitation. These lists define words used in myths and administrative texts. A word translated as create may also mean assign or set in place. Without context, translation choices vary. Fragmentation removes context, increasing ambiguity. Comparative reconstruction attempts to mitigate this. Editors compare similar passages across texts. This method strengthens confidence where overlap exists. It also reveals where overlap does not exist. No parallel passage describes an abandoned human type. Where myths revisit creation, they repeat function rather than revise form. Gaps in the record have also influenced popular interpretation. Missing explanations are treated as intentional concealment. Ancient silence is reframed as secrecy. This approach assumes that the texts aim to record hidden processes. The evidence suggests otherwise. Mesopotamian texts recorded outcomes relevant to ritual, law, and administration. They did not document mechanisms beyond what was necessary for function. The limits of the record are acknowledged within the texts themselves. Gods are said to know what humans do not. Fate is fixed but not fully revealed. This narrative device establishes hierarchy, not mystery. It does not imply that scribes withheld information about creation cycles. Material continuity further constrains interpretation. Settlement patterns shift but persist. There is no material horizon that aligns with a total human replacement. Fragmentation in text does not correspond to disruption in material culture. Where absence is significant, it is often noted. Flood narratives explicitly mark transition. King lists explicitly divide before and after. Lifespan changes are recorded indirectly through reign lengths. These markers show that scribes did record major shifts. The absence of a recorded second creation stands in contrast. The Anunnaki are consistently named across fragments. Their roles remain stable despite damage. They appear as a group associated with authority. Fragmentation does not produce conflicting roles. This consistency suggests that their function was well understood and did not include repeated design or correction. Modern reconstructions sometimes combine fragments across genres. A line from a hymn is paired with a line from an epic. Context shifts. Meaning changes. Academic editions caution against this practice. Fragmentary evidence requires restraint. Museums often display single fragments with brief labels. These labels summarize entire myths. Visitors may assume completeness. The physical fragment may preserve only a few lines. The gap between object and explanation is rarely visible. The limits of the record are structural. Clay tablets preserve what was written, not what was thought. Oral traditions likely existed alongside written ones. These oral elements are lost. Their content cannot be assumed. They cannot be used to fill gaps selectively. When evaluating claims about repeated human creation, the fragmentary nature of the evidence must be central. The record preserves enough detail to describe regulation, labor, and governance. It does not preserve evidence of abandonment or redesign. Fragmentation explains uncertainty, not contradiction. The Mesopotamian record is partial but coherent. Its gaps are real. Its silences are consistent. Where it speaks repeatedly. Where it is silent, it remains silent across centuries and cities. The limits of the record do not invite expansion. They require caution. The surviving fragments outline a system that adjusts conditions rather than replacing components. That outline persists despite damage. Continuity, presumed in daily records. Beyond mythological compositions, Mesopotamian archives preserve a large body of administrative and ritual material. These texts were not designed to explain origins. They were produced to manage daily life. Precisely because of this, they reveal what scribes and officials assumed without explanation. Across these records, humanity appears as a stable category. People are born, assigned roles, age, and die within an unbroken framework. Administrative tablets from the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE form the earliest written record of human activity. Found primarily at Uruk and later at Jemdet, Nazar, and Ur, these tablets record distributions of grain, beer, and oil. Individuals are identified by name or function. Workers are grouped by task. The texts do not introduce humans as recent arrivals. They record them as already integrated into institutional systems. This pattern continues through the early dynastic period. Tablets from Lagash, Umma, and Shurupak document land management, labor quotas, and temple provisioning. Families appear across multiple tablets. Fathers, sons, and daughters are tracked over time. The continuity of names and roles indicates generational succession. There is no administrative break that would suggest a replacement population. Legal documents reinforce this assumption. Contracts from the Old Babylonian period describe marriage, adoption, inheritance, and debt. These documents rely on kinship structures extending backward and forward in time. Clauses often reference obligations inherited from previous generations. Such language presumes continuity of human identity. A society that believed itself recently recreated would require different legal framing. Temple records provide further evidence. Ritual calendars list recurring festivals tied to agricultural cycles. These festivals are described as ancient even in their own time. Offerings are said to follow precedent. Priests cite earlier observances. The continuity of ritual practice depends on continuity of participants. Humans are assumed to be the same beings who served the gods in the past. Liturgical texts support this view. Hymns often address humanity collectively. They describe people as fragile, laboring, and dependent. These descriptions do not vary across periods. A hymn to Enlil from the Ur-3 period uses similar language to one copied in the Neo-Assyrian period. The consistency of description suggests that humanity was not thought to have changed in kind. Genealogical records are particularly revealing. Some tablets list family lines spanning several generations. In royal inscriptions, kings trace descent through named ancestors. These lists do not reset after mythological events. They extend through them. Even when floods or city destructions are mentioned, lineage continues. The text does not pause to explain survival. It assumes it. Funerary practices align with this assumption. Graves from different periods show gradual change in goods and construction, not abrupt replacement. Human remains display continuity in form and treatment. There is no archaeological horizon that corresponds to a complete human replacement. The texts and material culture align in this respect. Ritual texts addressing illness and misfortune also presume continuity. Exorcistic incantations describe ailments as recurring conditions. They reference precedents. A disease is said to have afflicted people before and will do so again. The language assumes a stable human condition subject to known risks. There is no suggestion of a fundamentally new type of human body. Administrative continuity is also visible in occupational categories. Terms for farmer, scribe, builder, and priest persist across centuries. Lexical lists preserve these terms. Their meanings remain stable. This stability indicates that human roles did not require redefinition due to a change in human nature. The Anunnaki appear occasionally in ritual contexts as witnesses to oaths. Their presence underscores order. The humans swearing oaths are treated as accountable agents, consistent with earlier records. Accountability presumes continuity of moral and legal identity. The system does not treat humans as provisional or experimental. Even in periods of upheaval, such as the collapse of the Akkadian Empire or the end of the Ur-3 dynasty, records resume with similar structures. Cities fall, new rulers emerge, administrative practices continue. Humanity is not reintroduced. It persists. Some texts explicitly reference the distant past. Phrases such as "since ancient days" appear in temple inscriptions. These references include human institutions. They do not mark a reset point. The past is continuous, even if altered by disaster. Where myths describe regulation after the flood, administrative texts show no adjustment in how humans are recorded. Lifespan changes inferred from king lists do not alter contract structure or ritual obligation. Humans remain bound to institutions in the same way. The absence of commentary on human replacement in these records is notable given their detail. Scribes recorded minor changes in rations, measurements, and procedures. A fundamental change in humanity would require acknowledgement. It does not appear. Continuity is also evident in education. Scribal training texts show students copying older works. The students are human descendants, learning from human predecessors. The chain of instruction does not break. Knowledge is transmitted, not rediscovered. The cumulative weight of these records supports a simple conclusion within their own framework. Humanity is treated as continuous. Conditions change. Institutions adapt. The category of human remains stable. These texts do not argue this point. They assume it. The assumption itself is evidence. Where continuity is taken for granted across thousands of documents, it reflects a shared understanding how the idea of a first humanity took shape. The concept of a lost or earlier humanity does not originate in Mesopotamian administrative or mythological texts. It emerges much later, through layered interpretation rather than direct record. Tracing how this idea formed requires attention to when explanations were added, not when events were described. The shift occurs outside the ancient corpus, in the spaces where fragments were compared, reordered, and explained for new audiences. In the ancient material itself, there is no term that clearly distinguishes one humanity from another. Words used for people, humankind, or the black-headed ones, a common Sumerian phrase for humans, remain consistent across periods. These terms do not change after the flood. They are not replaced. The language assumes a single category of being that persists through disruption. The first step toward the idea of an earlier humanity appears in late antique and medieval commentary, where ancient texts were already distant. Mesopotamian myths survived indirectly, through summaries, parallels, and echoes in later traditions. Flood narratives were preserved, but their administrative framing was lost. What remained was a story of destruction followed by survival. Over time, survival itself became interpreted as replacement. In early biblical interpretation, the flood was sometimes framed as a moral reset. Humanity before the flood was described as corrupt. Humanity after was framed as renewed. This theological distinction influenced later readers encountering Mesopotamian parallels. When similarities between the Epic of Gilgamesh and Genesis were identified in the 19th century, interpretive habits from biblical exegesis were applied backward onto Mesopotamian texts. This overlay altered emphasis. In Mesopotamian texts, the flood is regulatory. In later theological traditions, it becomes corrective. Once correction is assumed, it becomes easier to imagine failure. From failure, the notion of replacement follows. This sequence does not appear in the original tablets, but it emerges naturally from later frameworks. 19th century scholarship played a role in solidifying this shift. Early translators often worked across multiple ancient traditions simultaneously. They sought origins. They compared myths to identify primal events. In doing so, they sometimes aligned unrelated motifs. Long reigns before the flood were equated with non-human rulers. Shorter reigns after were equated with altered humanity. These associations were speculative, but they entered popular discourse. The discovery of the Sumerian king list intensified this tendency. The dramatic difference between antediluvian and post-flood reign lengths invited explanation. The text itself provides none. It simply records. Later readers filled the gap with narrative logic. If time changed, then beings must have changed. This inference felt intuitive, even though it was not stated. 20th century reinterpretations expanded this narrative. As scientific concepts such as evolution and genetics entered public awareness, ancient creation accounts were reread through those lenses. The language of shaping, mixing, and forming was recast as technical description. The absence of detail was treated as secrecy. The gods became engineers by default. At this stage, the idea of a first humanity became explicit. Some writers proposed that early humans were unsatisfactory, too numerous, or uncontrollable. Floods and disasters were reframed as corrective wipes. These ideas circulated widely, despite lacking direct textual support. Repetition gave them coherence. The Anunnaki were central to this transformation. Their collective authority was reinterpreted as centralized planning. Their role in assemblies became evidence of design meetings. Their presence in creation myths was expanded beyond authorization into execution. This expansion did not come from new translations. It came from narrative synthesis. Selective citation reinforced the pattern. Lines describing the creation of humans were quoted without surrounding context. Administrative language was presented in isolation. Flood passages were removed from their regulatory sequence. Over time, these excerpts formed a new composite story that resembled ancient myth, but functioned differently. Academic scholarship continued to caution against this approach. Philological studies emphasized that Mesopotamian myths were not linear histories. They were modular texts used for ritual, instruction, and legitimacy. Creation was not treated as an experiment, it was treated as an assignment. Regulation followed as governance, not revision. Despite this, the idea of a first humanity persisted in popular culture. It appeared in books, documentaries, and digital media. Each iteration added detail, often borrowing from modern science fiction. The narrative became increasingly elaborate while remaining detached from primary sources. The endurance of this idea can be traced to structural appeal. A lost humanity provides mystery. It creates distance. It explains disruption. It satisfies expectations shaped by modern storytelling, where prototypes fail and designs improve. Ancient Mesopotamian texts do not follow this structure. Later readers imposed it. The absence of contradiction within the ancient record is telling. If a first humanity had existed and failed, traces would likely appear across genres. Administrative texts would reference a reset. Ritual texts would distinguish eras. Genealogies would restart. None of these occur. Where Mesopotamian texts do mark division, they do so explicitly. The flood divides time. These divisions are recorded without explanation, but they are named. No similar marker introduces a new humanity. The notion of a first humanity also depends on conflating flood survival with creation. Survival is not creation. In Mesopotamian texts, survivors resume existing roles. They do not receive new bodies or functions. By the late 20th century, the idea of multiple human creations had become a common assumption in non-academic discussions of the Anunnaki. It circulated independently of textual evidence. The ancient record was used as reference rather than as constraint. The distinction between interpretation and source blurred. Understanding how this idea took shape clarifies its position. It is not hidden in damaged tablets. It is not implied by missing lines. It arises from later synthesis, driven by expectations foreign to the original context. The Mesopotamian texts themselves remain consistent. They describe one humanity introduced to serve, regulated after disruption, and assumed to continue. Where later narratives add another humanity, they do so without textual anchor. The idea exists in commentary, not in clay. What the tablets state without expansion. A small group of passages from Mesopotamian texts is frequently cited in discussions about multiple human creations. These passages are real. They appear in tablets that have been catalogued, translated, and retranslated over many decades. What matters is not their existence, but their scope. When read in full, within their physical and literary context, these passages describe limited actions with defined purposes. They do not describe iteration, abandonment, or replacement. One of the most referenced lines appears in the Atrahasis epic, where the gods decide to create humans to relieve themselves of labor. The passage describes clay being mixed with the blood of a slain god. The text names the materials. It names the reason. It names the outcome. The lines do not describe a prior creation. They do not state that an earlier attempt failed. The decision is presented as initial and sufficient. Another commonly cited section comes from Tablet VI of the Enuma Elish. Here, Marduk announces his intention to create humans so the gods may rest. The language is declarative. It follows the establishment of cosmic order after conflict among the gods. The creation of humans is positioned as part of stabilization, not correction. The tablet does not mention any earlier humans being destroyed or replaced. Some interpretations focus on variations between these two accounts. The involvement of different gods, the use of different divine blood, and the change in narrative setting are treated as evidence of separate events. In the tablets themselves, these differences are normal. Mesopotamian literature preserves multiple versions of the same function without attempting harmonization. Difference does not imply sequence, it implies coexistence. Another passage often extracted comes from flood narratives. Lines describing the destruction of humanity are quoted without the surrounding material that describes survival. In Atrahasis, the text explicitly names survivors. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim recounts how life resumes. These passages do not end with emptiness. They end with continuity. Destruction is partial by design. References to regret among the gods are also cited. After the flood, some gods lament the loss of offerings. This regret is sometimes framed as acknowledgement of error. In context, it is practical. The gods depend on human labor and ritual. Excessive destruction disrupts that system. The response is regulation, not redesign. The Sumerian king list is another source frequently invoked. Its long reigns before the flood are contrasted with shorter reigns after. The list itself offers no explanation. It does not identify the antediluvian kings as non-human. It does not state that post-flood kings are a new creation. It records reign lengths as a formal feature, not as a biological statement. Some later lexical texts use terms that are translated as to make or to create. These terms are applied broadly. They are used for cities, temples, laws, and roles. When applied to humans, they do not imply experimentation. They describe establishment. Without additional qualifiers, these verbs do not indicate iteration. Passages describing the fixing of destinies are also cited. The Anunnaki are said to fix the destinies of humans. This phrase appears in ritual and hymnic contexts. It refers to assigning roles and outcomes. It does not describe altering human form or essence. Destiny, in Mesopotamian texts, is administrative, not genetic. Some interpretations point to gaps in tablets as evidence that missing lines may describe earlier creations. This argument relies on possibility rather than evidence. Where large gaps exist, editors note uncertainty. Across multiple fragments and versions, no surviving line introduces a prior human species. The consistency of absence across sites and centuries limits what can be reasonably inferred. Another frequently cited element is the repeated use of flood imagery. Floods are sometimes described as total. Elsewhere, they are clearly local or partial. The texts themselves vary in scale. None describe a complete reset followed by a new creation. Survivors are named. Cities are rebuilt. Lineages continue. When passages are examined in full, they share common features. They are brief. They are functional. They address specific problems within a mythological framework. They do not linger on process. They do not compare outcomes. They do not evaluate success or failure. These are not traits of experimental narratives. The absence of comparative language is notable. The texts do not say, "this time," or "again," in reference to human creation. They do not contrast present humans with earlier ones. Where repetition occurs elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature, it is marked explicitly. Repeated floods, repeated kingships, repeated temple destructions are named. Creation is not repeated in this way. In legal and ritual texts that reference creation indirectly, humans are treated as a known constant. Oaths invoke the gods who created humanity, not gods who corrected it. Blessings refer to continued fertility and labor, not to restoration after failure. The language reinforces stability. Later commentaries written by Mesopotamian scholars do not reinterpret creation passages as iterative. Scholarly tablets from the first millennium BCE explain divine names and roles. They do not introduce alternative creation histories. Their focus is clarification, not expansion. Translation history sometimes obscures these points. Isolated quotations are rendered in modern language that implies intention and testing. When read alongside the original Akkadian or Sumerian terms, these implications weaken. The tablets describe actions, not hypotheses. What the tablets do not say is as important as what they do. They do not say humans were created twice. They do not say an earlier humanity failed. They do not say the Anunnaki revised their work. These ideas do not appear, even indirectly, in the surviving corpus. What they do say is consistent. Humans were created to perform labor. Their numbers required regulation. Disasters served as controls. Lifespans were limited. Institutions persisted. Authority was maintained through councils and decrees. These themes recur across genres and periods. When claims exceed these statements, they move beyond the tablets. They enter interpretation shaped by later expectations. The primary sources remain constrained by their purpose. They were not written to explain human biology or cosmic experimentation. They were written to preserve order. The distinction between source and synthesis is essential. The tablets provide fragments of worldview. Later narratives assemble these fragments into stories that feel complete. The ancient record itself resists such completion. The clay does not record a first humanity. It records one humanity managed within limits. Where later narratives introduce another, they do so without textual grounding. The tablets remain silent on that point, consistently and across time. Why the question persists without resolution. The question of whether humans were created more than once persists not because the ancient record suggests it, but because the record leaves space that later frameworks are inclined to fill. Mesopotamian texts were not written to resolve curiosity about origins in a comprehensive way. They were written to support ritual, administration, and legitimacy. As a result, they address only what was necessary for those functions. What lies outside that scope remains unaddressed, not hidden. One reason the question continues is the nature of fragmentary preservation. Broken tablets invite reconstruction. Reconstruction invites narrative. Narrative invites expectation. When readers encounter gaps, especially in origin stories, they often assume that something meaningful has been lost. In the Mesopotamian corpus, gaps are common, yet those gaps are distributed unevenly. They affect many topics without producing speculation in those areas. Creation receives special attention because modern audiences expect origin stories to be complete. Another factor is the difference between ancient and modern explanatory habits. Mesopotamian texts do not explain causes in the way modern readers expect. They record decisions and outcomes. They do not document trial, error, or revision. Modern technical language is built around process. When applied to ancient material, it creates the impression that steps are missing. The absence of steps is interpreted as concealment or loss, rather than as difference in purpose. The persistence of the question is also shaped by the way flood narratives are read. Destruction suggests failure in modern narrative logic. In Mesopotamian logic, destruction functions as control. This difference is subtle but significant. When flood accounts are read through later traditions that emphasize moral reset, they appear to imply replacement. In their original context, they do not. The tension between these readings keeps the question active. Translation history contributes further. Words related to making, forming, or establishing are often rendered as create. In modern usage, creation implies novelty and design. In the original languages, these terms are broader. They apply to cities, laws, roles, and orders. When these translations circulate without explanation, they reinforce assumptions of intentional engineering that the texts do not describe. The question also persists because it aligns with familiar storytelling structures. Modern narratives often involve prototypes, revisions, and improved outcomes. This structure appears in technology, science fiction, and engineering history. When ancient myths are read through this lens, repetition is expected. A single creation, followed by regulation, feels incomplete to readers accustomed to iterative design. The Anunnaki, as a collective authority, become focal points in this process. Their lack of detailed description allows projection. Where texts describe them as judges or council members, later readers imagine planners. Where texts remain silent, imagination supplies motive. The less the texts say about their actions, the more adaptable they become to modern interpretation. Media format plays a role as well. Extracted quotations circulate more easily than full translations. Short passages, detached from context, are easier to reinterpret. Over time, these excerpts form the basis of arguments that feel textual but are structurally disconnected from the source material. Repetition of these excerpts across platforms gives them weight independent of context. The question persists because it is rarely settled within the same frame in which it is asked. Ancient texts are treated as answers to modern questions. When they do not respond directly, the lack of response is framed as mystery. In reality, the texts were never intended to address those questions. The mismatch sustains debate. Academic scholarship does not resolve the question in popular discourse because it does not frame the issue in the same terms. Scholarly work emphasizes limits, context, and restraint. It explains what the texts do, not what they might imply under alternative frameworks. This approach does not produce definitive statements that satisfy speculative curiosity. The idea of a first humanity also persists because it offers explanatory economy. It provides a single answer to multiple anomalies. Long rains, floods, lifespan changes, and divine regret are unified under one narrative. The Mesopotamian record treats these elements separately. Later synthesis connects them. Cultural memory reinforces this synthesis. Stories of lost worlds and vanished ages appear across cultures. When Mesopotamian material is placed alongside these traditions, similarities are emphasized, differences are minimized. The resulting narrative feels ancient even when it is modern in structure. The absence of explicit denial in the texts allows speculation to continue. Mesopotamian scribes did not write to refute future interpretations. They wrote to maintain order in their present. Silence is not argument, it leaves space that later readers occupy. The question also persists because it cannot be conclusively answered using the surviving material. The record does not provide enough detail to support multiple creations, but it also does not provide commentary on why creation is described only once. This asymmetry keeps discussion open without advancing it. Within the Mesopotamian worldview, unresolved questions were normal. Fate was fixed but not fully revealed. Knowledge was tiered. Gods knew more than humans. Texts reflect this hierarchy. They do not seek to eliminate uncertainty. They manage it. The endurance of the question reflects modern expectations more than ancient intention. The texts remain consistent in what they present. Humans are introduced once. Conditions change. Authority governs. Continuity persists. The question of repetition arises when readers expect explanation where none was offered. The tablets themselves do not evolve to accommodate the question. New discoveries have refined readings, not altered structure. As fragments are added, the pattern holds. No new tablet introduces an earlier humanity. The persistence of the question is external to the clay. In this way, the lack of resolution is itself a product of translation across time. Ancient records meet modern frameworks. Where they do not align, tension remains. That tension sustains inquiry without altering evidence. The Mesopotamian texts end where their function ends. They preserve order, memory, and precedent. They do not close interpretive loops. The question remains open, not because it is answered twice, but because it was never posed in the first place. If you found this video interesting, consider subscribing for more documentaries like this. You can also leave a comment with a topic you'd like covered next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.